Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Mondays with Maishi. This is Moshe Norman out of Lakewood, New Jersey. It is February 17th, 2025. And tonight we're joined with our featured guest, Joanne Twombly, who is a licensed clinical social worker out in Boston, Massachusetts. I think this is the second week in a row that we are featuring New England, Boston region. So go Boston. Before we know it, they'll be selling us real estate there, right? Okay. Well, I hope it's not as windy in Boston as it is in New Jersey today. It's been quite a situation here. Uh, Phone lines and wires falling down and trees being blown all over the place. Okay. Joanne, thank you very much for agreeing to participate and come on and talk about your book, um, which I'm going to show soon on our I'm going to share the screen so you can see the book. The book discusses dissociation, the treatment of internal family systems for dissociation or DID and trauma-informed IFS. This is something that is somewhat of a novelty, as far as I understand. IFS doesn't talk much about something being different when we're treating people who split or dissociate, and I hope that we're going to get to discussing that soon tonight. So, Joanne, again, thank you for joining. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what your background here is, and how you came to get into or get excited about IFS, dissociation, and how you sort of put these two things together. What's the history behind that?
So the history's getting longer. But thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I was excited to come on here.
It's our honor, and I'm sure it's going to be fun as it always is.
So when I was working in an agency in the 90s, there was a woman who was treating somebody with multiple personality disorder, which is now called dissociative identity disorder. She was going out on maternity leave, and I thought, that sounds kind of interesting. Maybe I'll ask for that client. And I never got around to it, but they gave her to me anyway. So I started learning how to treat her, which other people who had treated her hadn't learned. And so that's basically how I got to work with a lot of people with dissociative disorders. And along the way, I learned hypnosis. Um, Dissociation is actually a trance state. And hypnosis isn't, it isn't like magic. We all go into trances. I mean, the one that's probably the most familiar to us is highway hypnosis, like when you're driving down a highway and suddenly you realize you've gone way further than you thought you'd gone. Or, it's automatic pilot, or being in the zone is a kind of trance state. So I learned hypnosis, and then I learned EMDR, and I wrote one of the first chapters on integrating EMDR with dissociative disorders. Early on, EMDR started out thinking they could use standard EMDR for everything. And then they found out they were popping people out with dissociative disorders. People were getting decompensated. So they recommended that before you start doing EMDR, you use a diagnostic to test out to see if people have dissociative disorders. So there's some knowledge in that area. I did EMDR, I do EMDR. I've done a lot of EMDR. And then internal family systems came along. And I wasn't planning on learning how to do it because I had already been working with people with parts for a long time. And I really didn't think I needed another parts model. But there was our local trauma association had somebody come and do a talk on IFS. And then all the people in my consultation group started asking me questions about it. So I was like, oh, I have to learn this. But I was really happy that I did because it's such an elegant model. And I do have some disagreements with it. I mean, I was very excited to hear that you didn't need to teach people coping skills and that the model, I'm always up for shortcuts. But then I found out that it didn't really work for people with complex trauma disorders as smoothly as I hoped, and certainly not with people with dissociative disorders, where parts are significantly more separate. And so I started giving workshops on using internal family systems with people with dissociative disorders and eventually wrote this book. So it's the only book that's written on the integration of the trauma and dissociation field with internal family systems. I
Okay.
did write a chapter on it a couple of years before that, but there isn't anything else on it. So I'm sort of it, which is getting lonely. I hope somebody else starts doing some work in that area. I think it's so important. Since my book came out, I've gotten emails from people all over the world saying, I read your book, and now I know why my IFS therapy hasn't been working, why I've been getting worse and worse. So there's kind of a range. There are people who kind of stalemate and don't make progress,
Mhm.
or people who start decompensating.
Joanne, if there was somebody who was interested in picking up on this, would you somehow guide them or be in touch with them, or are you just kind of hoping somebody else takes over and joins you
I
in
think
this?
I think what I'm trying to do is I was going to say infiltrate. That doesn't sound so good. What I'd like is, I mean, I know that IFS believes, the hardcore IFS people believe that all you need is standard IFS. And since I work with people who've fallen apart in standard IFS and sometimes by people who are trainers, I think it's important that they start integrating some of the knowledge in the complex trauma world. I mean, healed by people have been healed by ego state therapy or working with parts um, from training in the complex trauma and dissociation world. It would be a good integration. And I'm into integration. I like different models. I don't think everything works for everybody.
Mhm.
And it's nice to have different tools.
Okay. So let's go back to what you said earlier. First of all, I just want to acknowledge that you are an EMDR consultant and you are certified in IFS. Let me repeat that. You are certified in IFS.
I am certified in IFS. I'm
Even
not
if
a
you don't agree, even if you don't agree with every little piece of it.
Listen, I think IFS is great. I love the way they work with parts. I think the language is great. I use it every day I work. I do think they should add in some things about dissociation and coping skills. Um,
Okay. But I want to first go back to the EMDR for a moment. You said that EMDR at first had begun to recognize that there was a problem, that people were decompensating or splitting or dissociating, um, or what they call leaving their window of tolerance, perhaps when using the eye movements.
Getting destabilized.
Yes, and so they decided to create diagnostics and insist that people first identify whether they struggle with whether they dissociate or whether they have DID.
They didn't have to create the diagnostics. The diagnostics have been created for a long time and they're very available. And they're also very accurate. I mean, if you send somebody, the problem is that people don't always know about them. If you send someone for um, psych testing for dissociative disorder is not included in the regular package. So people can go for psych testing and not get correctly diagnosed. Um,
But the idea was that EMDR wanted to know prior whether
right.
somebody would
So
dissociate and in order to what?
in order to prevent EMDR therapy for bombing.
And therefore they would not treat them with EMDR, or did they then
No,
create a
what
protocol
they
in
did was they recommended that therapists who treat people with dissociative disorders know how to do it, so have training in it, and then know how to use EMDR for those clients. And I think what's mostly important is to know how to work with parts. And in terms of, let's say that the place I've gotten the most training is from the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, and from our local society, which unfortunately bit the dust a couple years ago. I think COVID was one of the problems, and we'll get it going again. But that's where I got a lot of my training, was through trauma societies.
Mm-hmm.
And EMDR is good for people with habit disorders and trauma disorders. And what they recognized was they needed to add in information from the dissociative disorder world. IFS hasn't done that.
Mm-hmm.
IFS is sort of in an odd place because it is an ego state work model. So people who have parts or where they have parts are drawn to IFS, but they don't really know how to treat people who have dissociative disorders. So they get in over their heads, or people get destabilized. I have a client who has been on for a long time, was involved with a discussion group for people with dissociative disorders. And he said when somebody came on and said they were in IFS treatment, he said, we always knew they were in trouble. Just across the board.
Okay. I want to ask you, before we jump into the appropriate IFS treatment for dissociative disorders, tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that come up when you have somebody with a dissociative disorder or with complex trauma and you're treating them with IFS. What are some of the indications that we're up against the problem? What are some of the countertransference that may come to play from the complex PTSD or whatnot? Tell us a little bit
I
about
think
that.
one of the problems is that, wait a minute. There was something I wanted to say and it just flew out of my head. I'm sorry.
Did you dissociate?
Something like that. Okay, right off the bat, IFS tends to start out with a very positive sales pitch about IFS. Got this great therapy, IFS, we work with parts, we get people into self-energy, and and Dick Schwartz, the IFS guy, talks about being a hope merchant. So this can really help. The trouble is if somebody has a dissociative disorder, which mostly means they have some kind of complex trauma history, not only trauma, actually the basis is poor attachment, like disorganized attachment, abandonment, and traumatic neglect when you're very young. And in those families that have those characteristics, they tend to be the parents who don't notice that their kid's being abused by the group down the street, or they don't have the best management skills themselves, so they tend to maybe abuse their kids too. So you get this really complicated picture where kids are neglected and abused in some complication through their whole childhood. It's not just one time.
Mm-hmm.
And they just don't have a lot of strengths. I mean, if something goes wrong, they abuse their kids, they drink. If something goes wrong, they dissociate, they disappear. I mean, this doesn't give kids a strong foundation. And it just makes life really difficult. Actually, dissociation isn't the problem. It's mostly if somebody is able to develop a dissociative disorder, it's probably one of the healthiest way to get through one of these really difficult childhoods.
Mm-hmm.
The thought is that people who Some people are better at sports than other people. Some people are better at dissociating than other people. If people aren't so good at dissociating or can't, then they tend to end up having either killing themselves early on or tend to be very drug dependent, alcohol dependent, non-functional. So having a dissociative disorder, then you have the part who's being raped at night, the part who goes to school, the part who handles learning things, playing after school sports. Um, it's a way of compartmentalizing, and it really can be quite protective. So what happens when somebody goes for IFS treatment if they've been dissociating um, their whole life? Um, is the IFS therapist starts talking about parts, and that can be a mixed bag. I've had clients who I had a couple clients who actually left those initial IFS sessions and never went back because the therapist talked about parts. And with a dissociative disorder, you may or may not know you have parts. You may have had to dissociate them very deeply. Or you may be afraid that someone will think you're crazy if you have parts. Or you may think that the person who's trying to find out about the parts is going to try to find out about them to take them away from you and abuse you. So it can be really scary. I had one guy waited for 2 years to see me because I worked with DID. And then he came in and spent close to 2 years trying to convince me that he didn't have parts because he was so afraid to work with them.
Hmm.
It's like if keeping parts a secret is one of the ways that you survive,
Mhm.
it's not going to be something that you can do a 180 with and suddenly chat about with a therapist.
And trust
So,
somebody to make you that vulnerable.
exactly. So, that's one of the problems that IFS therapists don't get trained to really watch people. And if they start talking about parts and the person starts turning greenish, you probably want to back off and give them context, find out what's happening. And then the hope merchant thing. If you're too, oh, this is going to help you. These are people who've generally been lied to a lot. There's been a lot of bait and switch. They've been betrayed a lot. And hope is not their friend because a lot of times when they feel hopeful, then something bad happens. And their whole childhood is a series of maybe there's a little bit of hope. They think things will get a little better, and then that hope is destroyed.
Hmm.
So you have to be very careful about hope.
About pushing hope.
Yeah, you don't want to push it. You have to really respect that hope can feel dangerous and hope can feel like a setup. And then the self can be very difficult for people with dissociative disorders. A lot of people I work with say there is no self. There's no one inside. I'm shattered. I'm completely shattered. There's no me. There's
Hmm.
no I. And if you, like I was working with one woman who spent 8 years working with a trainer and could not get into self. And the therapist kept working on her getting into self, and she just couldn't. And that therapy didn't go too well. So now she's now done because she transferred over to me. And eventually we got her into self, but it wasn't by saying, okay, it's there. Just get the parts to relax back and self will be there. It's just
Mhm.
not that easy.
Mhm. Okay. So these are some of the challenges, I suppose, with practicing classical IFS or IFX, having IFS expectations when you have a
Yes.
client or a patient who suffers from complex PTSD or dissociation.
And I like the way you said that. If you are an IFS therapist and you have the expectation that IFS is great, but it just doesn't work it doesn't work the way it's expected to with these kind of patients. Or
Mhm.
you might get, I've done consults and the therapist will say, oh, yes, she can get into self, da da da. It's not self. It's a self-like part. It's a compliant part who's acting like they're in self. Um, and it looks kind of like self, but
But
it's
this
not.
is in general, this is a very good countertransference discussion in general. I'm trained much more, standard dynamically or analytically dynamically, and I like to make as few suggestions or assumptions and let the client sort of go where they take, we go wherever the client takes me. And the point that you're making, let's say, as to uh, um, pushing hope, or telling a client to go somewhere, to go into self, always in my mind risks, sort of like behavior therapy in my mind, always risks a certain countertransferential reaction, in that if my father was so bossy and controlling and authoritarian, I may have to do what you tell me to do because you're telling me to do it, right? And then you may be reenacting my childhood stuff, and not actually helping me. I may have to do the homework that you told me to do because you told me to do it, and I'm afraid to not do it, or I'm afraid to admit to you that I didn't do it. I couldn't get myself to do it. Anytime there's a behavioral suggestion, recommendation, or instruction is really, I guess, the most proper word here. We're risking a very strong reaction, countertransference reaction. And what I'm hearing you say is something similar to that, which is some people can't tolerate or handle an instruction or hope, which you're telling them to hope. They can't
It's just too scary,
trust you, but they also can't argue with you.
right? Which is a real bind.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
you're right. It can become a reenactment of a childhood bind.
Hmm. Hmm.
'Cause these are people who are often put into binds as kids and no-win situations.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I need help. You're telling me to do something I can't do, but I have to do it anyway.
That's right. That's right.
Um,
Especially if they've been hurt, and traumatized, then that could be very threatening. And then they get into another bind, which is, I might want to stop therapy, but I can't stop therapy because the therapist is telling me that this is going to work for me, or is telling me to come back, or whatever. So
or the
there's
therapist might be the very first person that they ever felt like cared about them. And
another reason that
so,
they can't leave.
right, if that's in short supply, I mean, I treat people who've been in therapy. I think the longest the person has been in therapy is 50 years. But certainly people who've been in therapy for 10, 20, 30 years without making a whole lot of progress. And
Mhm.
that's just terrible. Now, you said something about that you don't like to tell people what to do. And I do tell people what to do to some extent.
Mhm.
If I know somebody has a dissociative disorder, I mean, what I'm going to do first is identify that. And IFS doesn't like diagnoses because they think they're pathologizing. I think therapists pathologize. Um, and I think diagnoses aren't perfect. The DSM has a lot of political things about it, but it's kind of like shorthand. You know, if somebody comes in with a diagnosis, I have some kind of idea what's going on,
A
but I'm
framework,
going to
right?
make up my own um,
Treatment.
treatment. Anyway, I'm going to decide what I think is right in terms of whatever diagnosis they come in with. A lot
Hmm.
of people have come in with ADHD, bipolar, eating disorders, and that all may be to some extent true, but they also may have a primary trauma disorder that's never been treated.
Hmm.
And I usually say to people, okay, I hear you've got ADHD, but let's do the trauma work and see what that ADHD looks like.
Hmm.
Trauma pours gas on other problems. And so maybe if you have ADHD, it could make it look worse than
Hmm.
it needs to be.
Right. I want to just remind everybody, for those of you who have questions or comments, such as I believe Rivka did in the chat box, please raise your hand by using the React tab on the bottom of the screen. And we'll call on you and you can certainly present your question or comment. So, Rivka, I don't know who you are, but if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. If you can turn on your video, that's great. If you can't, that's just almost as great.
Got Rivka's question because
What is
it's
it?
in the chat. What happens when we address the part that dislikes parts language and treat that as a part? I mean, there are lots of reasons why people don't like parts language. I did a consult on someone who had a parent with DID and didn't like parts language because she didn't want to, her mother was really toxic. And so she said, I don't have parts. And yeah, sometimes it's as easy as just acknowledging that that part that doesn't like parts language is a part. Sometimes it's more complicated. If I'm working with somebody who doesn't want to, oh,
I'm just
God,
I'm showing you the book for anyone who wants to see Joanne's book. Didn't mean to disturb.
yes, this is my book. I think from my website, which I guess is listed somewhere too. I have a couple workshops coming up and they're listed on my website. So um, what I was going to say is that when somebody doesn't want to talk about parts, I talk about parts. I do that anyway. I normalize it. I mean, one of the things that's beautiful about IFS is it's taught widely that everyone has parts. You know, there's the professional part of me, there's the couch potato part of me, there's the play with the kids across the street part of me. I'm slightly different in all those different parts of me. But for me, the parts are integrated. So if I'm playing with the kids across the street and I suddenly have to shift into professional mode, that's smooth. I don't lose any information. Somebody with DID might have trouble switching out of that kid mode or switching out of professional mode. So it's different. But what I do, and that business, the IFS thing saying that we're all multiple, that's not new. Ego state therapists have known that forever. And it's pretty obvious because we all talk about the part of me this, the part of me that. But what I start to do if somebody really is allergic to thinking that they have parts is I talk about my parts and I do it sort of randomly. I might say, God, I didn't want to get up. The part of me didn't want to get up this morning. It was so rainy out or it was so windy. And another part of me said, get out of bed. You like going to work. Or something random like that. Or a part of me wanted to go on vacation. Another part of me decided it'd be fun to go to this workshop. So I'll just bring up parts in this kind of casual way. And I also notice if a client's talking parts, even though they don't want to. It's like, you're really good at your job and a part of you is really insecure, or there's that side of you that's insecure and thinks you're doing a bad job. Although there's clearly a very competent side of you that always gets great reviews. So I might use different language. I might talk about
Sides of you instead of parts.
right.
Okay.
So, some way of helping people normalize it. That's people with dissociative disorders don't come from different planets. It's just sort of an end of a spectrum. And we all dissociate, in fact. I mean, I was, one example I think about is I used to have these fights with my husband, sort of just as I was leaving for work. He'd say, oh, Joanne, I just want to ask you 3 questions. Won't take very long. And I'm like running late as usual, and I don't have any time. And then we'd have a fight. And then I'd go to work and I'd leave him at home. I wouldn't think about him all day. That's a way of compartmentalizing because, I'm at work. I've got to focus. So I don't have time to think about Dave all day. maybe during lunch break. But that's one example I use of how we normally compartmentalize. When we have to focus, we just put other things to the side. Or if I tie my shoelaces, I don't think about it. I just tie them. If I had to teach one of the kids across the street how to tie her shoelaces, I'd have to dredge that material out of where I've stashed it in my brain and then teach her. But normally that info is dissociated. So dissociation's normal. We all dissociate. It's healthy. But then, it can get kind of kicked on steroids depending on the childhood. Mostly what I do with people is I teach them how to use their dissociative skills in a higher tech way. So a lot of people, it's a kid solution. You get raped at night, you shove a lid on it. If you don't think about it, it's dissociated. And what I might say is, yeah, you put all this bad stuff under a lid unconsciously, and it's an all or nothing lid. So let's just evolve it into a container so that you have more choices and more control. And then you can take a percentage out of the container. I guess I am talking a little bit about the function and role of amnesia. This is another question that came in. So that would be an example of amnesia, and the function of it would be, I think one of the classic examples is a kid who gets molested at night by her father and then goes down for breakfast and he's cooking pancakes and everybody's cheery. So what was it that happened that night? There's no evidence of it, what's happening at the breakfast table. And then the kid has to go to kindergarten. The kid's not going to be able to manage kindergarten if she's thinking about what happened the night before and what's probably going to happen the next night. So that's a role of amnesia that's very helpful.
So how is that different? How is amnesia different from dissociation? Isn't that what dissociation is?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So Yaakov, if you have a more specific question, raise your hand and let's take it live. Okay. Joanne, tell us a little bit about how you actually practice with IFS. I mean, what is it that you modified in the IFS model to treat this complex PTSD or dissociation?
Standard treatment for trauma. And this is the research is that the best treatment for trauma is 3 phases. So the first phase is some kind of stabilization, coping skills. The second phase is paced uncovering of traumatic material, paced resolution of traumatic material. You don't want to do it all at once. Sort of like it didn't happen all at once. It's too overwhelming to do it all at once. You need to pace it so people stay in the window of tolerance. And I typically get people coming to me when they're way out of the window of tolerance. I've had people come to me when they're on disability because they've really been run down by a previous therapist who's did to them what I was told to do in college. Somebody's got a sex abuse history, help them feel their feelings, help them find their rage, help them find their terror. It's basically help them fast track to the hospital because it's too overwhelming. You have to teach someone how to manage terror before you get the terror up. So what I do in the first phase with somebody with a dissociative disorder, whether I'm using IFS or not, and mostly I am using IFS, is I want to have them to have system-wide coping skills so that as the parts are unburdening whatever the traumatic material is, they have a way of managing it. Or I'm teaching them how to witness a percent of the information, not 100%, because it's a slippery slope. It can get out of hand pretty quickly sometimes. What IFS would say is that, oh, you just tell the exile, ask the exile if the exile would be willing to hold the burden and not overwhelm self or what passes for self. And I think the issue with that is sometimes the exile has a burden that's dissociated and isn't aware of what they're agreeing to do. And, you know, it's a little bit like meditating. I used to treat a lot of people who fell apart while they were in stress management meditation programs. And the problem is that when you meditate, it decreases your surface defenses. And then there's an increase in intrusions. And so people would start to meditate and then they'd reach the traumatic material and get overwhelmed with flashbacks. And what they teach you in meditation, which works great if you don't have a big trauma history, is something comes up, you notice it, and you let it go. But if it's an avalanche, it's a little harder to let it go. And that's what happens with these people. And I've worked with people or done consults with people where they start witnessing and it's like an avalanche.
Mhm.
Just the traumatic material spills out.
So Joanne, could you give us some illustration, either through a demo or I don't know if you have videos that you can play for us and show, or just, demonstrations or ideas of what are some of these skills, resourcing or management,
Okay,
that
well, I
you.
talked about one, containers. So um, if it's actually not so hard to do, I mean, like my example of my husband, he pisses me off in the morning. I go to work. I have to focus on work. So I compartmentalize. So it's just taking that ability to compartmentalize and making it into a container. Now, with my trauma clients, I just find some symptom or some way that they're unconsciously doing that anyway. So a client might, I might know they don't have much memory for some of their childhood. And I'll say, yeah, you're unconsciously doing a container. What kind of container would you like? We're just going to work on this so the ability's conscious and you have more control and more choices. So what kind of container would you like? Um, and I don't know, what would you come up with?
uh, um, does anybody want to do a role play here with Joanne? Can we get a volunteer? Cecil, can we get a volunteer here and help us?
I guess if my computer's not gonna freeze, I'm gonna I'm gonna say one
Conven
thing that I do.
conveniently freeze. Okay,
Okay.
go.
Well, let's see if you have a computer that freezes. That's kind of like a container, right? That
Kind of.
information is suddenly missing.
Yes. I had it before. I was like, oh, shoots. Okay. Yeah, I'll volunteer.
Okay. So what kind of container would you like?
Do I need to first choose like a problem or do I just choose a container?
Well, I guess you could choose a problem.
Okay,
Um,
I have. I have. Okay, we're good. Oh, I'm so sorry it came so soon. No, we're good. I'm glad that my life is full of good things. That there's just one thing that I can think of.
okay. Um,
Ready.
so there's one thing that bugs you.
Yep.
Okay. And so is it something you think about constantly? Or are there times when you're distracted from it?
It's a temporary situation. I want it to pass. I just need to wait for it to pass. Do
And
I need to say what it is?
no,
Okay.
during the day, do you think about it constantly?
Often.
Often, but always? Or there's sometimes you don't think about it?
Sometimes that I don't think about it.
Okay, so sometimes it's kind of pushed off to the side.
Yes, I'm assuming that as the day of that event, I would probably have more time. I would probably spend more time thinking about it until it
Yeah,
passes.
absolutely. If you're in the middle of it, then you would. But this isn't something that's happening right this second, right?
No, no, couple of days.
In a couple days.
In a couple days, yes, yes.
I'm sincerely glad it'll be over in a couple days.
Thank you.
I think I think with the container, what I would say is, for one thing, obviously you're not going to lose this information. It just might be an easier way to carry it. So a
Okay,
container could be anything that keeps that information or that event or whatever it is kind of pushed over to the side. So it
okay,
could be like putting it in a bank vault, or could be putting it in a Tupperware container,
okay,
uh, could be putting it in a computer file, kind of a secret file on the computer.
okay.
I don't know what appeals to you when you think of having a container. What kind of container would you like?
I'm thinking of like a grocery box. You know what I'm talking
Okay.
about? That cardboard.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay. And just notice that in the grocery box is built a commitment to paying attention to this when it's the right time and taking care of it when it's the right time. This is
hmm,
not the kind of container where you put something in and shove it off and forget it forever.
hmm.
Um, and it sounds like this would be a container for you that you could put in it and take a break from it,
Okay,
right? Because this is actually something that's coming up pretty soon.
yes, yes.
So um, just notice how big the grocery box is. And just notice that with everything you put in the grocery box, every bit of whatever this is, it gets stronger and stronger. So you can just notice it going in right now in just the right way.
Okay. It's like the energy, the anxiety, the stress, like everything's going in there. Any extra stress because of this event?
Mm-hmm. And as that anxiety and stress is going in, the grocery box is getting stronger and stronger.
Kind of like holding it, like the ability to hold everything.
Yeah. And so just notice where you want to stash this box, this grocery box too.
I'll put it on my back porch
Mm-hmm.
because it's cold outside. And I would probably only want to go visit it when I really feel the need to. So I don't really want to have too much access to it. I hate the cold.
So just notice what it feels like to have this grocery box on the back porch where it's in the cold and it's holding all these things that it needs to hold. And there's a commitment that when you need to, you'll take care of it. It's not going to be forgotten about forever. But temporarily, it's okay to take a break. And just notice what that feels like.
Can I say that it feels like a little secure because there's kind of ice building up? That's something
Mm-hmm.
that's coming up for me.
That's great. So ice is reinforcing the box.
Yeah.
And just notice Notice what changes as you feel the ice coming over the box.
It's interesting. Before I said that, I felt like a sense of anxiety, like there needed to be something to support a little bit more. But as I was saying that, I was like, okay, feels a little better.
Yeah, you're doing great. So as you focus on this box just for the moment, just notice if there's anything else that it needs. Could be another 40 layers of ice.
Oh, that I'm afraid I won't be able to get to it if I need to.
Oh, you'll be able to get to it because there's a commitment built into it that
Okay.
everything that's stored in it will be taken care of at the right time.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm kind of allowing as much ice, kind of like an igloo.
I
I don't know if
once
I'm giving too much.
I once was used an ice chainsaw. So I'm just remembering that. And I think I'll let you borrow it.
Oh, thank you. I like that.
So you can just have it there. And if you need it to get inside, that'll be easy.
Okay. Okay. Now that makes it easier to comprehend. Okay.
And this thing isn't used to being contained. So as it's contained in this container, something is already happening that's different.
Yes, yes, I can feel that.
So what's that like?
It feels rewarding to be able to do something like this, allow myself to get rid of certain things, not need to carry the burden.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to. It doesn't do me a service. It's cool.
You did great. You know,
Thank
I often, when I've helped with EMDR trainings or when I do bigger trainings, I often start out with containers because all the therapists I know, including myself, have somewhat dysfunctional families. And I know some people haven't finished working on things. And so I start with containers because, we never know when a client's going to come in and something about them pushes our buttons. And sometimes that's because something's going on in our lives or
So
there's
are
some
you
kind of
saying,
traumatic material that's not been worked through. And I think containers are really helpful.
yeah. So are you saying before even starting therapy as a therapist to kind of use the container thing on ourselves?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, IFS has a process of IFS suggests that before we meet with a client, I think this is a good idea, but I mostly only do it when I'm meeting with a client who's pushing my buttons. Um, so you kind of scan through yourself, identify what parts are activated by the client, and then you ask the parts to give you some space. And this is called the fire drill. At least that's what they called it in my level 1 training. And then the two questions you get into self in relation to the parts. And the two questions you ask are, what do you want me to know about the client? And once the part feels like you really get that, what do you need from me so that I can do the therapy from what IFS would say it's self? I call it my adult therapist self. Um, and So one of the things that sometimes I think parts need is a container. They sometimes need a safe space. I just did a fire drill exercise with someone, and what her part needed her to know, what the part needed to know was that she was 50 and had a psychology degree and lots of experience. And the part thought she was 10. So that was very relaxing for the part to know that she was 50. And the part's like, oh, yeah, okay, you can handle this. Um,
So first of all, thank you, Cecil, for doing this.
yeah,
Joanne,
thank
so
you.
Joanne, so what happens when it comes so here's a demonstration of how to create a container, which helps create a lot of safety. But how does this apply to the IFS process? So now we have
Well, what I'd say is, say somebody has enormous amounts of burdens, um, has an extensive abuse history. You can't work with it all at once, especially if a lot of it's dissociated. You don't want to work with it all at once. So, what I might say, and this is whether I know what's dissociated or I don't know, or I might know something about it, but not details. And I'm not going to ask for details because I don't want to bring all that information up. So I'll say, let's put all that stuff that happened to you when you were a kid in a container. What kind of container would you like? Um, and I might do it a little smoother than that one was because I didn't know you at all. Um, but uh, so, as I said before, if someone's say missing some memories, or if they come in and they say, sorry, I missed last week. And I'm like, well, actually, you were here last week, and that happens more often than you'd think. So I just say, well, let's just use your ability to blank things out and make a container. So let's put all that stuff from your childhood in a container. And then we might make a smaller container for 10% of it, or uh, some trauma that didn't happen that much. Say a person had been date raped. We'll put that in a smaller container. We might start witnessing a percent of the smaller container and then unburden percents. And once we finish that container, the person will have more energy because some of the trauma is gone. And we'll learn something about how the person processes and witnesses and unburdens. And I've
so
used
wait,
some kind of,
I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. Are you saying that you isolate different traumas and allow the client or the patient to focus on those without needing other parts of them to come protect because we're addressing a specific trauma? So whatever protectors
I might ask, like, uh, I'm trying not to think of, I mean, mostly what I think are these heavy duty things that some of my clients have had to deal with. Um, One thing I started with somewhat with one person was that her father beat her dog to death and said, if you tell anyone, this will happen to you. Um, so there were 3 or 4 parts that were involved with that. The rest of them didn't know anything about it. Um, so I worked with those 3 or 4 parts on that one particular trauma. So we isolated that one trauma that was in a smaller container. Other things were in different containers. And
I'm just I guess
I,
what I'm trying to figure out, what I'm trying to understand here is what stops. I understand you put things into containers and that's a nice visual, but what stops if we address somebody's trauma or a trauma and they need to access the coping mechanisms, which, i.e. dissociation here, will they be able to uh, retain that sense of isolation or separation, or do they need the coping mechanism that may be in a different container to jump in and help protect them? In other words, can you effectively isolate things?
Yes. If you don't mess with their dissociative abilities.
Hmm.
I mean, if the person hasn't been in therapy where the therapist has gotten everything out and really made them decompensate, then it's much harder. But
Hmm.
if someone comes in with intact dissociative abilities, um, then you can take a certain problem. But you have to understand, we've been practicing this. I'm not going to do this the first time I meet with someone.
Hmm.
Um, I'll work on all the parts having safe spaces. So in this case, all the parts were in safe spaces and had soundproofing and feeling proofing up. So they were not present. The only parts that were present to work on this particular trauma were 3 or 4 parts that had been involved in it. And then we worked bit by bit on it. Take out 2 seconds worth, take out another 2 seconds worth, take out 5 seconds worth. You have to make sure that these parts can work together and feel like they're in control.
Hmm.
So I'm giving them control and choices. And little by little, we work through that whole thing.
I see.
Does that make more sense?
I think so. I think you're really just creating very small scale, bite-size pieces without the person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a great way of putting it. I chatted with a fellow who had a client who had a really bad LSD trip 10 years before and couldn't go near it, was really phobic of working on it. And I said, okay, this is what you do. You chunk it down to bite-sized pieces. And they're the container thing. I sometimes will work with people on you know, using getting a small container of material and then starting with that. And then that one's done. Then you get another one. That one's done. Uh okay, somebody
Okay.
was
Yeah. Let's take Usher. Usher has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering, what would you call those containers? Would you say they're managers, or would you say they're an aspect of self? Would you say they're similar to the imagery we use in the healing steps?
I don't think that they're not parts. They're I don't think of containers as parts. I think of containers as containers,
External vessels that you're bringing
external
in.
vessels. Right.
Hmm.
I also don't put parts in containers. Um, Although, it's all metaphors, I suppose. I had one client who had all her parts in safe space containers. And that just threw me off completely because I think of traumatic material going into containers and safe spaces being for parts. But parts also have control. Like parts can put 100% of material in a container, or they could put 50% in. Um,
So
Part
would you
could be
say
in,
that's the material is the pain of the exiles, or
well, that's an IFS thing too, because I think managers and firefighters also have burdens.
mm,
And depending on how complex the system is, those burdens can be pretty bad. As I also think exiles have jobs, which is something IFS doesn't think. I think if you're carrying around burdens, kind of like carrying around 5 bags of groceries, that starts to feel like work. Um, so I would argue that exiles have the job of carrying burdens, but so do managers and firefighters. They might be different burdens, but um,
Okay. Joanne, what else
thank you.
is there besides creating these, containers or ways to manage the overwhelming uh, experience, losing window of tolerance. What else do we need to know that's, let's say, included in your book or in your program?
I use safe spaces a lot, and the word safe is kind of in quotes, because any words can get twisted in some childhoods. Like the person says, you're safe with me. Let's have fun, let's play, and then molest them. That person isn't going to like using the word safe. So some people say, oh, just call them calm spaces. And I'm like, calm, comfort, it doesn't matter. Words can all be twisted. Um, so I just watch my clients, and if a word is triggering for them, then I avoid that word until we've managed to detoxify it.
Okay.
This woman, or not a woman, I don't know who it is. This person says the container had to be so big, it was a big storage room. And then they take out boxes. That's perfect. Um, it's whatever works for the client. One of my clients had all of his material was in an unexploded bomb. Um, that was the container. So, and then I've had people who've had one woman used an umbrella stand that I had in my office. It didn't even have a lid on it. And she had god awful trauma in there. And I thought that would never work for me. It worked perfectly for her. So I could never
Cool.
get rid of that umbrella stand.
Okay. I want to tell everybody just to take a look at joannetwombly.net, where you could see both Joanne's book as well as the upcoming trainings that she has. And in this way, you'll be able to become more informed. Joanne, what do the trainings specifically focus on that's not IFS based or?
They're the one in California, which is coming up the end of March. I did the first third of it in December, and it's available online. It was basically phase one. So it was teaching safe space imagery and containers, and um, some of the setup for diagnosis, really working with people with complex trauma and dissociative disorders with a little bit of EMDR mixed in. Um, the second 2 days are going to be more of the second two phases. So a lot of unburdening and witnessing and how to do that safely with this population. And then whatever else is needed. I mean, I know that IFS says parts are parts are parts. Parts never get lost. I think there's a place for some integration. I think people integrate into a healthy self-led system as they heal. I had one client with 50 baby parts. Nobody needs 50 baby parts. And those baby parts, when we finished working on the trauma that had blown them all apart, they integrated into one baby part who had all the information from the 50 baby parts and felt stronger and more
Hmm,
secure.
hmm.
Um,
Okay.
I think there's a place for some integration.
Does anybody else have any last questions or comments before we call it a night? Or Joanne, is there anything we missed? As you
Well,
said.
I think I want to say that the conference I go to that I really have learned the most at and continue to learn at is the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. And their annual meeting is coming up in March. And I'm giving a 3-hour pre-conference workshop on IFS and nonverbal communication, which is one of the keys of doing this work. Because if you're shut up your whole childhood, then it doesn't always make sense to be able to say everything. And
Mhm,
if you've dissociated material, it may not be available. Oh, it overlaps with Purim. Oh, that's not so helpful, is it? But I
mhm,
did want to say anyway, in case it works for anyone, that I can get people in for the early conference admission rate. Just drop me an email. But that's too bad it overlaps. I know they usually try not to.
I want to thank, by the way, Aaron Herzog for connecting me with Joanne, as he so often does connect me with these wonderful clinicians, practitioners, and innovators. And Aaron's asking me a question about depersonalization. He says that there's many who say that depersonalization has a very poor prognosis. Is this any different? I mean, as far as I understand, depersonalization is just another form of dissociation. Is there any difference?
Well, there's a couple of possibilities. One is that sometimes people have DID, but what shows up first is depersonalization. So as they're treated, they can connect more with feelings. I mean, depersonalization is really a form of detaching from feelings. If people have straight depersonalization disorders, it does tend to be a longer and more difficult treatment. Person who's done the most work with depersonalization disorder that I know is Daphne Simeon, who I think is from New York City, and has at least one book out on it, maybe more.
Okay, well, Aaron, maybe you'll pick up Daphne, and we'll host her and feature her one day. Okay, Elliot, go ahead.
Yeah, so the question I always ask is, so what role do you see the therapeutic alliance playing in your work?
I think pretty much everything.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that completely. I know when people come in, I usually start out by saying, look, I ask a lot of questions, but you don't need to answer any of them. So if there's something you don't want to answer, just let me know. And if I get something wrong, let me know I've got something wrong. A good example would be, hey, come to ISSTD. Yeah, but it overlaps with a major Jewish holiday. I'd want to know that. I don't want, but I'm guarding against forced compliance. So a lot of my clients have the experience of, somebody saying, stand here while I abuse you or I'll hurt you worse. Something like that trains you to be very compliant.
But Elliot, I'm curious. What was your intention of the question? What do you mean? How
Well,
much?
I mean,
That's a good question.
I in any treatment, the client has to kind of go along or feel safe with any given point in that treatment. So at least I know in the work I do, I'm constantly assessing where we are in the alliance. Where can I tease the client about a certain situation? I mean, like, I have a client who's had a lot of trauma in her background, sexual trauma, and I think we're at the point where I talk, as a way of desensitizing her. I talk about predators. I made a comment to her like, yeah, well, one day you'll get married. You just have to find the right predator, right? So I mean, like, that's horrifying on a certain level. But if you get an understanding of what I'm trying to do is to desensitize her to the ability to talk about that part of her trauma and even make a certain light of it, if you can see what I'm doing with it.
Well, I think humor helps a lot. I mean, I've had a couple of clients who had almost no sense of humor, and I really had to ratchet it down. I will tell people that I'm kind of a wise ass, and that if I make a joke and it doesn't sit right, let me know and I'll rein it in. I also tell people, because a lot of therapy models will start by saying that you need to develop trust. And I'm like, yeah, if I grew up in your family, I wouldn't trust anybody. I wouldn't trust me either. Don't worry about it. And it depends. I mean, when I've worked with people, I worked with a couple of people who had more sadistic offenders, and sadistic offenders get to know their victims by observing them. So they tend to feel worse and worse in therapy because the therapist knows more about them. And so what I did with one woman was I sat on the floor for some weeks. And I said, I'm getting old. I'm getting creaky. I like sitting on the floor, but it'll take me a while to get up. What's it feel like for you if I'm sitting on the floor? And she said, it feels better. I said, great, I'll just sit on the floor. Let me get a couple pillows. But we also practiced her being able to walk out of the office. And we oriented her to her height because some of the child parts thought they couldn't reach the doorknob and they couldn't unlock the door. So I had her practice leaving the office and coming back in, going downstairs and out to her car, and coming back in. And that really gave her a sense that she had many more choices and possibilities. Really went from her feeling trapped in this office with me to feeling like she could be mobile. So, I mean, I work hard to try to figure out what's going to make someone feel safe enough to sit in the same room with me. And there's a whole wide range of how I do that. But I think I don't say things like, oh, I really get it. I understand, because I didn't grow up where they grew up. I don't understand. I wasn't tested like that in my childhood.
Okay, thank you for that question, and thank you for that. I just want to thank Joanne for participating tonight and sharing this very important piece, to IFS and I guess how to increase the success rate and efficacy of treating people with IFS when they have dissociation or
Well,
complex.
in the right treatment, the research it's Bethany Brand. She's someone you should have talk. She did this fantastic research study on a shoestring. It's still going on. And I mean, this predates Bethany Brand too, but in the right treatment, there's an over 80%, I don't know if it's always heal rate, but do much better rate. That's a huge percentage in the right treatment. And the right treatment has to do with coping skills, symptom management, paced
You're
working
talking
through.
about 80% in DID?
Yeah.
Ah, interesting. Fascinating.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's
well,
one of the biggest mental health conditions with the most success rate in treatment.
really?
So
You
it's
like that?
really too bad when people don't get the right treatment.
Okay, Joanne, thank you again for coming on tonight. And everybody, I hope you enjoy your week. Until next time, good night.